Chessman Dan, back at it again at day 7 of playing chess every day until I could beat Julio with a stick. In today's game, I will be playing as white. Recap of my chess activity in between day 6 and 7. I've played a lot of games. I did not count it up. I was able to shoot up from a roughly 380 elo all the way up to a 450 elo, around estimating right now. The issue with that is that I slowly began to lose a lot. And every time I review the game, most of the games I'm winning. However, I either blunder a piece, but more times than not, I miss an opportunity to checkmate, which then allows my opponent to win. In the past, or up until now, as white, I usually stick to the accelerated London system opening, and as black, I usually play the King's Indian defense. However, I kept losing, particularly as black, and I figured instead of just throwing out the King's Indian defense, until I'm efficient with that, I'm just gonna stick to basic openings, regardless if I'm white or black. The idea being, I will play for the center, develop my pieces, and castle. And once I go up high enough elo and I continue to practice my openings, I will re-implement my openings. So this is actually the first game in which I decide to implement that strategy. So I'm going to start off with pawn e4. Now my opponent responds pawn to d6. And sticking to the philosophy, if I have an opportunity to put 2 pawns in the center, I'm going to do that. My opponent responds with pawn to a6. Chess.com is stating that black is playing a perk defense, but based on how my opponent played, I don't even think my opponent knows what that is. I respond with knight to c3. My opponent responds with pawn to b5. I develop my other knight to knight f3. Here, my opponent may or may not be trying to play the perk defense. I'm not really too concerned because thus far he's not threatening anything, and now I am creating a stake hold for the center. My opponent goes with pawn to g6, and thus far the evaluation is saying he is playing the perk defense, so maybe my opponent was trying to. And then respond with bishop to e3. However, the only issue with that is I'm guilty of it, and many other people around my elo are guilty of playing openings with just straight memorization, not really understanding the main line or sidelines. Right here, my opponent plays bishop to g7, which is, now looking forward, he's definitely playing the perk defense because he's fianchetto. He just fianchetted. I don't know if I said that right. I now respond to bishop g3, pawn to g3. The idea of being is that I'm going to move my light squared bishop up and fianchetto as well, and then castle. My opponent responds to knight to f6. I do the same thing. I put my light squared bishop to g2. Here, my opponent activates his light squared bishop, or just to bishop to b7. And now both the bishop and the knight is putting major pressure on my center pawn. Here I castle. Fast forward a bit. My opponent then pushes his pawn to d5. I respond with knight to e5. My opponent responds with pawn to e6. Here, I take with pawn takes on to d5. My opponent then takes with his pawn. I push up my bishop to b4, or my pawn to b4, and the idea being I want to prevent that pawn. So if we go back a bit, a lot of times in the past, while I'm so focusing on the action, let's just say, I don't know, I go here, or I want to, not the best move, I usually find myself getting kicked out. And here, I would literally have to move. And I didn't want my knight to get kicked around. So my opponent castles. The moment he castles, I now have a direct opening of where I'm going to go. The way the perk defense is operating, he's controlling a lot of the queen side. So the moment I see my opponent castle king side, I will now, or the plan is to attack king side. My opponent goes knight to e4. I respond with knight to f6, f4, excuse me. Here, my opponent goes knight to c3, and I think this is where he starts to make mistakes, is that he's putting pressure on my queen. However, my queen could easily move, and aside from my queen, he's threatening nothing else. See here, in a few moves, he goes back. However, the knight is defended by the pawn. I decide to kick out my pawn to a4, and the idea is if I take, or my opponent takes, I will open up my a-file. My opponent goes bishop c6, and if we go based on the evaluation board, before that move, it is 0.1 advantage for white, which literally means nothing for my elo level. However, the moment he kicks out his light squared bishop to b6, it goes from a 0.1 to a 0.32 advantage. I take. Now the opponent, that bishop is being attacked by two things. He takes my pawn, putting pressure on my queen. I push my pawn out to c4, performing a fork on both the bishop and the pawn, as well as being attacked with the knight. Here, my opponent takes. However, he wasn't aware, or maybe he did, but didn't care, that is being protected by my knight. Here he takes with the pawn, which hangs his knight, because only thing protecting his knight was that pawn. And now he's leaving his rook hanging. However, my opponent doesn't know, or maybe he does. No, he doesn't. Free rook. In just a few moves, so yeah, give it about 6 moves maybe, we go from an even game to now I'm 0.91 up. Here my opponent pushes his pawn. I take a free pawn. He pushes again, and now I begin my attack. I put my rook to d5, putting pressure on that queen. He moves his queen to g5, leaving it hanging. And now white is at 0.24 advantage. Unfortunately, I can't keep going because my opponent resigns. So, although not all games are going to go my way, I feel way more confident just sticking to the basics, and I will implement openings once I study them more and I get more depth into them. I'm just going to stick to the basics. See ya.